May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. A long time ago, I was a young kid growing up in the early 1960s. I know, last century. Life in our small New York town was significantly different from life today in many ways. That's not to say it was better or worse for that matter, just different. It was just before the civil rights movement really kicked into high gear. And before things like flower power and hippies and the anti-Vietnam movement. Kids in our neighborhood, on our block, roamed the neighborhoods on our bikes after dinner in the summer, and we played games like Capture the Flag until well after dark. I had a friend who lived just a few houses down the street, and one day we noticed that he and his brothers weren't hanging out with us anymore. There were whispers among our parents. It's the first time I remember hearing the word divorce. It happened between his parents, and the stigma attached by our parents cost us all good friendships. Not too long afterwards, everyone in their household packed up and moved away to separate homes. The stigma that broke up our friendships found its roots not just in small town gossip and scandal, but in the harsh teachings of the church as well. After all, what is it that Jesus says in today's gospel? Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. But before we spend any time in the gospel, it would do us well to recognize that much of the church's and society's attitudes towards women find their roots in the garden story of Genesis 2 and 3. This creation story, given to us literally from male-oriented translations, continues to be used in many religious and political settings to promote a male-centered church and a male-centered society. Even today, in the 21st century, there are authorities who exercise power and authority over women in ways that promote and sustain abuse. There are ministers and politicians who demand that spouses, usually pointing at the woman, that demand that spouses stay in marriages even when being mentally or physically abused. But I believe in my heart, with all of my heart, that God does not call us into nor desire us to stay in abusive relationships. The late Phyllis Tribble wrote about what she referred to as texts of terrors. I don't mean on the phone. I mean the biblical texts of terror. That is, passages that are throughout the Bible that minimize the full humanity of women, more than often putting women's lives at risk. That has long been the case with how this morning's story from Genesis has been used. Woman, the inferior. Woman, the servant. Woman, the servile. Phyllis Tribble reimagined that text using knowledge of language and culture not available to early translators of the Bible. Images of the woman's creation from the rib of Adam, the human one, a creature who, by the way, at that point in the story, is not yet referred to as a male person in the original Hebrew. Those images were actually meant to proclaim equality in their earliest telling. It can be frustrating as we read English translations so many thousands of years later. The man referred to in the beginning of the story is a non-gendered being. There's nothing in the original language about its maleness. Hadam actually means earth creature. We could also just say human one. And in fact, the Hebrew word zela, I'm not great on my Hebrew pronunciations, but the Hebrew word zela doesn't precisely mean rib, but rather side. More like the image of a side of beef than just a rib. It conjures up an image of the two living side by side, rather than over and above. And side by side is much better unless you desire or need to have power over someone. Then in our brokenness, we embrace the idea of male being over and above and the helper woman as subordinate. When the Hebrew is mistranslated, then misinterpreted, and finally misappropriated, the words create images of inferiority and submission. For thousands of years, these misinterpretations have not only come at a cost for women, but for all of humanity. For when any part of humanity is diminished, the whole of humanity is diminished as well. Words such as helper, used in the creation story, somehow get twisted into broken realities such as servant or property, losing all sense of partnership, all sense of inclusivity, and all sense of equality intended in the original language. The Hebrew words used to describe the woman as partner are different from the words used to describe the animals as helpers in the early story. The words used for woman connote equality. She is the helper who is a counterpart. In this story, God is the helper superior to the man. And woman, the animals are helpers inferior to man. The woman is a helper equal to the man. Look back at what happens when the animals are being presented to Hadam, and he doesn't find one suitable as a partner. Doesn't say he doesn't find one suitable as a junior partner now, does it? It says partner. Thus, out of Hadam, the human one, God creates Ish and Isha. That is, man and woman. The first time gender is assigned in the story. The male human being and the female human being become partners in creation. Tribble argues that this is the ideal for marriage based on the story we heard earlier this morning. But Jesus has a way of reminding us that ideals are difficult to grasp and to retain. In today's passage from Mark, Jesus is finally getting close to Jerusalem. In Mark's gospel, he's spent all of his time up to this point in Galilee and the Gentile regions north of Galilee. Now he's coming to Jerusalem, the place where all great prophets eventually find themselves. The country teacher and preacher finds himself in the region of the big city, and crowds come out to see and hear him teach. Most likely, they're also hoping to see a miracle or two along the way. And a group of Pharisees from the region come out to test Jesus. In essence, they're there to check on Jesus' bona fides, checking to see if he's legit or not. This isn't a fight between adversaries. The church has done such a terrible job of mislabeling and mistreating Pharisees out of secular warfare with Judaism at the end of the first century. This isn't a fight between adversaries. Jesus and the Pharisees aren't at each other's throats throughout the Gospels. Rather, it's more a debate between different schools of Phariseeism, because Jesus was closer to a Pharisee than anything else you want to categorize in his day. They're not trying to trick Jesus in this setting. Rather, because there were several schools of thought about marriage and divorce in Jesus' day, they're just trying to figure out which school of thought, which theological camp is the foundation of his teaching. When is divorce okay? They're basically asking. And Jesus responds that they are asking the wrong question. The question you should be asking is this: what is marriage supposed to be? In today's gospel lesson, Jesus holds forth an ideal focusing on what's supposed to be a lifelong partnership in marriage. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Yet we don't actually really understand most of the time is that this is an incredibly subversive statement by Jesus. This comment is Jesus' response to a patriarchal world in which women's standing could be fragile. And while there certainly were women in Jesus' day who could offer support, there were women in Jesus' day, several of whom supported his ministry financially, women of means. He even had the wife of Herod's steward helping him out. There was also an imbalance of power in favor of men. So here's the Pharisaical wrestling match. A more traditional interpretation of the law which allows divorce to take place between a husband and wife, most of the time initiated by the husband, over and against the strict view taken from Genesis. It's a man's world in the first century, and men hold most of the cards when it comes to such decisions about marriage. Jesus takes the power away from his listeners. A simple reading of the Gospels quickly reminds us that Jesus said many tough things throughout his ministry, things that sometimes make us scratch our heads in bewilderment. Beginning with last week's passage about cutting off limbs or tearing out eyes, his teaching about hating one's father and mother, to the overwhelming idea of taking up our own cross and forfeiting our lives to follow him. Jesus often makes us flinch. Many of his teachings were never meant to be taken literally. Rather, they were, like many of his contemporary teachers, instances of hyperbole and harsh language to bring us up short, to shock us into listening to the deeper truth he's trying to teach. In this case, marriage, like all relationships, is meant to be life-giving rather than life-draining, and therefore is meant to be taken seriously. Our faithfulness, therefore, is demonstrated not in complicated codes, but in how we extend God's love and mercy to one another, even to the least among us, even to the smallest child. The time has come for these stories to stand as models of grace-filled relationships rather than as memorials to the patriarchal power and fear of the past. And quite possibly such a freeing of imagination and an opening to God's grace will allow us to see the many different ways that humanity upholds one another and mirrors the love of God in our relationships. Perhaps seeing our ancient stories in new ways and from different perspectives will allow the church and society to recognize the grace and beauty which exist around us in caring and loving relationships. Caring and loving relationships which honor the image of God in each of us. Amen.